Before, the kitchen was cold that morning. Not bitter, just the kind of cold that settles into old wood floors and stays there. No matter how long the stove burns, I remember standing at the counter, my hands pressed into dough, flour on my wrists, the smell of wood smoke coming through the gap under the back door. Jacob was already outside. I could hear the soft crunch of his boots in the snow. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. Everything felt exactly the way it always would, except something inside me had already moved. And I didn't know yet that one quiet word, one small honest word, was about to cost me 8 years of myself. I'm Rebecca. And this is where I tell the stories I kept silent for too long. If you've ever had a word follow you, a label that wasn't yours but became yours. Anyway, this channel is for you. Subscribe and stay close, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been called something that changed how you saw yourself? The morning I'm thinking of was a Tuesday in February. I know it was Tuesday because we had sewing circle that afternoon, and I had been looking forward to it, genuinely looking forward to it, the way you do when community is the whole of your world and a room full of women feels like warmth you can hold in your hands. I was 23 years old. I had been married to Jacob for 4 years. I had a daughter who had just learned to walk, and a life that fit the shape I had been handed, and I wore it the way you wear something made for you, without thinking, without questioning whether it fit. That is what Gelassenheit looked like from the inside, not forced, just settled. The way a quilt lies flat when every seam has been pressed down smooth. I grew up in a small community in Lancaster County. Not the kind of Amish life people imagine from the outside. Not harsh, not joyless. There was real beauty in it. Sunday mornings when the whole district gathered, and the singing rose up through plain walls into plain sky. The smell of my mother's bread on cold mornings. The way neighbors came without being asked when someone was sick or grieving or behind on their harvest. I believed in what we were. I believed obedience was goodness. That was not something I had decided. It was something I had simply absorbed. The way children absorb everything, without knowing it is happening, without knowing it will one day matter. Gelassenheit, the yielding, surrender of self to God and community. That was not a rule I followed, it was who I was. I married Jacob at 19. He was kind. He is still kind. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because what happened between us was not a story of a cruel man and a frightened woman. It was something quieter and more complicated than that. Jacob loved me in the way he had been taught to love, protectively, steadily, with the firm belief that he knew what was good for our family, and that his knowing was a form of care. I believed that too for a long time. We were both products of the same ground. We had both been formed by the same hands. What came later, what I'm about to tell you, was not his failure alone. It was the shape of the water we both swam in, and neither of us could see it yet. That Tuesday afternoon at Sewing Circle, a question came up about a change to how the women in our district handled a particular aspect of the Ordnung, the unwritten and written rules that govern how we live, what we wear, how we speak, how we worship. It was a small matter, genuinely small, but I had a thought about it, a clear, reasonable thought, and before I understood what I was doing, I said it out loud, calmly, briefly, not to challenge anyone. Just because it was true and I thought truth was always welcome. The room didn't erupt, nothing so dramatic as that. But I felt it, the small shift like a temperature drop you notice in your skin before your mind catches up. A few women looked at their hands. One smiled, not warmly. One older woman turned her eyes to me in a way I had never been looked at before. And then the conversation moved on. As if I hadn't spoken at all that night, Jacob sat with me after our daughter was asleep. He held my hand. His voice was careful, not angry. Not hard, he said. You should have said that today. I told him I hadn't meant any harm. He said he knew that. He said it gently. He said, but that kind of thing, it doesn't come from you to say. I lay awake for a long time after he fell asleep, turning that sentence over. That kind of thing doesn't come from you to say. I told myself he was right. I told myself I had overstepped. I folded the thought away, like something borrowed that needed to be returned. I didn't know yet that I was already being watched differently. I didn't know that one sentence, mine, not his, had already started something I wouldn't be able to stop. It happened again. Of course it did. Not because I was defiant, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I had thoughts, and thoughts are not so easy to unlearn once you realize you are allowed to have them. Second time was a disagreement with Jacob's mother, polite, measured, but mine. She had made a decision about our household that I felt was not hers to make. I said so quietly in front of 2 other women. Third time was a book, a small plain book of poetry, nothing scandalous, nothing forbidden in any written rule, that I had borrowed from a woman on the edge of our district. Someone saw it, someone mentioned it. And the fourth time I simply did not go back to a Sunday singing after the meal, because I was exhausted, genuinely exhausted. And I thought exhaustion was reason enough. It was not. None of these things were large. That is what I need you to understand. None of them were acts of rebellion. They were just me, small pieces of me, surfacing without permission. What I didn't know was that each one was being noted, not written down anywhere. We don't work that way. But noted in the way communities note things, in memory and in manner, in the slight cooling of voices that once were warm. I noticed it first with the women I had been closest to. Nothing said, nothing done, just a fraction less ease in their presence, a fraction more distance in their eyes. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I had been too sensitive, too much inside my own head. Jacob never called me disobedient to my face, not once, not in those years, but I heard it from the air around me. From the way a conversation paused when I entered. From the way certain invitations stopped arriving. Disobedient was not a word they said to me. It was a word they said about me, in spaces I was no longer welcome in, and slowly, the way fog fills a valley in the night without you watching it, I began to believe it about myself. One afternoon I was in the garden alone, picking beans, the late summer heat sitting heavy on my shoulders. No one was nearby, no one was watching, and for the first time I asked myself, out loud, barely above a whisper, am I wrong or am I just different? The beans were warm in my hands, the sky was wide and quiet. I didn't have an answer, but the question didn't leave. Stayed with me the way questions stay when you're not allowed to ask them anywhere else. They go inward, they go deep, and they wait. What I didn't know yet was that this question, this small, private question, was the beginning of something I couldn't see the end of. And the punishment I had been living inside hadn't even fully shown its face yet. The punishment was never announced. That is the thing I have tried to explain to people since, and it is the thing that is hardest to make them understand. There was no moment where someone stood before me and said, "This is your consequence." There was no formal shunning, no, Maidung declared. No community gathering, no official turning away. What there was instead was Jacob's presence, constant, careful, watchful presence. He began, somewhere in that second year, to be very close to every decision I made. What I cooked, who came to our door, which women I spent time with after church. He never raised his voice, he never used hard words. He would simply appear in the doorway, in the conversation, with a thought about how things ought to go. "I think maybe not her," he would say about a friend. "I think maybe we should keep it simple," he would say about a plan I had made. Correction. Continuous, quiet, exhausting correction. I told myself it was love. For a long time I believed that. The spiritual isolation came next. Or maybe it had been building all along and I only began to name it then. Prayer circles I had attended for years began to happen without me knowing, not because I was told to stay away. Because I simply stopped being told when they were. The information moved around me like water around a stone, present everywhere, touching me nowhere. After Sunday services, when women gathered in small clusters the way they always did, talking softly, leaning close, I would move toward a group and feel the conversation find its natural end just as I arrived. No one was cruel. No one turned a cold shoulder in any way I could point to and say, "There, that is the thing." It was more like I had become slightly transparent. Like my outline was still visible, but something essential inside it had been quietly switched off, and everyone could see it except me. My God was still mine, I said to myself on the harder nights, but their God, the one that lived in the warmth of that circle, he felt very far away. I began to make myself smaller. I didn't decide to. I just noticed one day that I was doing it, had been doing it for months, maybe longer. Opinions I once would have offered, I now held behind my teeth. Questions I once would have asked, I swallowed. I stopped reaching for things. Stopped beginning sentences that might lead somewhere unexpected. I watched myself do this and told myself it was maturity, wisdom, the proper settling of a wife into her life. Gelassenheit, I told myself. This is what surrender looks like. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Jacob was sleeping, and our daughter's small breath came soft through the wall between our rooms, I lay there and felt something I had no word for then, a kind of hollowness, not grief exactly, not anger, just absence, as if I had been slowly, carefully, room by room, emptied out. The morning I understood came without warning, the way most real things do. I was standing at the mirror in our bedroom, just dressing, nothing significant, a plain Tuesday like any other. And I looked at my own face and I did not know who I was looking at, not in a frightened way, in a very quiet, very still way. Like coming into a room you have lived in your whole life and finding all the furniture gone. Rebecca, the one who had an opinion about the Ordnung that afternoon, the one who borrowed the poetry book, the one who said no, "I'm too tired," she was not in that mirror. What was there was obedient and careful and correct. What was there had learned to take up no space. I stood there for a long time. The floor was cold under my feet. Outside, snow was beginning again and I thought, This is what 8 years looks like. This is what the punishment was, not shame, not shunning. Me gone, I met Miriam that spring. She had been gone from our community for 12 years, had left quietly, the way people leave when they want to cause the least harm, and had built a life somewhere in Ohio. She was back briefly for a family matter, and we crossed paths at the edge of her sister's property on a gray April afternoon. We had perhaps 15 minutes together. I don't know why I told her as much as I did. Maybe because she was outside the circle, outside the pressure, outside the watching. Maybe because she looked at me the way someone looks at you when they remember who you used to be. I told her I felt lost. I told her I didn't know how to explain it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said simply, "You gave yourself to them. But can't you give yourself from yourself? That part, they can never actually take it. You just have to stop leaving it out where they can reach it." She said it gently, without drama. Then her sister called her name and she walked away. Those 2 sentences sat inside me for months like a slow fire. Miriam had carried her own version of my story. I learned pieces of it later. Through her sister, through memory, the same label, the same gradual cooling. The same years of making herself smaller until she looked in a mirror and felt the same hollow stillness I had felt. What she had chosen was not the path everyone assumes. She had not declared freedom, had not walked away in triumph. She had simply decided that surrender did not mean self-erasure, that Gelassenheit, read carefully, read honestly, was about releasing pride and ego, not about releasing your voice, your discernment, your God-given sense of self. She still loved the community she had come from. I left the people, she told her sister once, but I did not leave my faith. My faith was never theirs to hold. Both things were true. They are both still true. I needed to see that it was possible to hold two true things at once before I could begin to hold my own. I went back to the Ausbund, the old hymnal, the one we had sung from since childhood, words carried down through generations of plain people who had themselves known pressure and exile and the cost of conviction. I read it differently than I ever had, and I read what I had been taught about Gelassenheit, truly read it, slowly. In the way you read something when you are looking for what you might have missed. Surrender to God. Release of self-will, not the erasure of self. Not the death of the person God made. I had been taught two things as if they were one thing, and they were not. Obedience and disappearance are not the same. I had not been disobedient. I had simply been present, visibly, uncomfortably, inconveniently present, in a system that needed its women to be quiet enough to be invisible. My presence was the problem, not my sin. The night I finally understood, fully in my body, not just my mind, I was putting our daughter to sleep. She was 6 by then, small and serious, with Jacob's eyes and my stubbornness, which I had started to think of as stubbornness and not as strength. She looked up at me in the lamplight and asked, the way children ask things, without knowing the weight of what they're carrying. "Mama, are you happy?" The lamp was warm, the quilt was thick. Everything in that room was exactly what it was supposed to be, and I had no answer. I opened my mouth and nothing came. She waited, patient, watching me, and in that silence I understood what the punishment had truly been designed. Not to break me, not to drive me out, but to make me into someone who would one day look into her daughter's face and have nothing true to say. That was the design, and I decided quietly in that lamplight that it ended there. I did not leave. I want to be clear about that, because I know what you might be expecting. The moment of escape, the clean break, the triumphant exit. That is not this story. I am still here. I am still Amish. I am still Jacob's wife, and Jacob and I have found slowly, imperfectly, a way toward each other that has more honesty in it than the first years held. What changed was smaller than leaving and harder than leaving. I started speaking again, not loudly, not defiantly, just truthfully. One opinion offered, one question asked, one "no, I don't think that's right" said in a voice that didn't apologize for existing. The community did not transform around me. Some of the coldness remained. Some of it, over time, thawed. But I stopped measuring myself by their temperature. I stopped using their silence as a mirror. If you have ever lived inside a label, carried a word that was not yours, worn a name that someone else put on you, and then watched it become the name you answered to, then you already know what I am saying. Your question is not disobedience. Your voice is not rebellion. Your presence, your full, inconvenient, complicated presence, is not something that needs to be corrected. The kitchen is still cold in the mornings. My hands still press into dough before the house wakes, but I stand there differently now, lighter, more my own. Punishment tried to make me disappear. I am still here.